Welcome back to Face the Nation. Vaccine efforts around the world are also picking up speed. Senior foreign correspondent Liz Palmer reports from London.
Good morning. There was a good news milestone this week. The number of vaccinations given worldwide was greater for the first time than the number of new recorded COVID cases. That's partly due to aggressive public health action, like here in Brazil. Teams pushed into the Amazon to vaccinate people in remote villages who wouldn't have a hope of getting to an ICU. And the very first vaccine shipment arrived in South Africa this week. Such a big deal that officials, including the president, came out to welcome it in the pouring rain. But wherever there is vaccine in both the developing and the developed world, there are plenty of takers. From Morocco to Sweden, where the majestic hall normally used to award the Nobel Peace Prize was being repurposed as a vaccination center. In spite of the progress, though, this pandemic is more lethal now than it was last spring. Twice as many people are dying daily than in mid-April 2020, with terrifying local surges, the worst of them at the moment in Portugal. It's got the highest death rate anywhere in the world, and it had to welcome German doctors and equipment to help. COVID has reminded millions that life is fleeting and precious. Take Rosario, hospitalized with COVID in Madrid. She was wheeled to see Fernando, her partner of 14 years. He'd finally proposed to her by text from his bed, and she joyfully replied, "See?" It's also worth noting, Margaret, that in this push to vaccinate, there are some deliberate holdouts, notably New Zealand and Australia. They closed their borders early on. They have virtually no COVID cases, and so for now, they've decided just to watch and wait.
Liz Palmer in London, thank you. We want to go now to the World Health Organization's COVID-19 lead. That's Dr. Maria van Kerkhove. She joins us from Geneva, Switzerland. Good to have you with us, Doctor.
Hi, Margaret. Thanks for having me.
You're an epidemiologist. You specialize in zoonotics, which means you know a lot about how these viruses jump between species like COVID did. These new variants, you've described them as a combination of mutations all at the same time. What does that mean?
Well, these viruses change all the time, and every time they replicate, the more they spread, the more changes that they can have. These are called mutations. These are individual changes in the genome itself. These variants have had a combination of mutations, which mean a number of mutations identified at the same time. And so that means that this clustering of these mutations happening at the same time are quite different than individual level mutations. And we've had 3 such variants being reported, actually 4 such variants being reported in the last few months. The first in Denmark, the second reported from the United Kingdom, the third from South Africa, and the fourth from Brazil.
So which countries have actually been successful in containing the virus? And is there a common approach to their success?
Well, that's a great question. There is a common approach that many countries have taken to control the SARS-CoV-2 virus, including these virus variants that have been detected. And it's a combination of factors. It's individual level measures that we've seen people take, you and I, in terms of our physical distancing, our mask wearing, our avoiding of crowded spaces, our opening of windows, our sneezing into our elbow. All of those measures are really critical, as well as government-led responses where we have all of government, all of society approach, where we're conducting active case finding, where we know where the virus is. We can support people who are infected through good clinical care. We make sure that those individuals are isolated. Any contacts of confirmed cases are provided supported quarantine so that if they are infected themselves, there is no opportunity for them to pass the virus to others. Making sure that we open up our workplaces safely, our schools safely. It's a combination of factors. And many countries have done well in having an aggressive approach to making sure that they have the testing, the tracing, the clinical care, and really strong, empowered, enabled, and engaged communities. It's all of this. You hear us say a lot, do it all. This is what we mean by when we say do it all.
When you're talking about things like enforcing quarantine, it sounds like you're talking about Australia, New Zealand. Are those the best examples?
We have great examples all over the world of how countries have used these combinations of factors. When I use the word quarantine, I'm using this in the sense of contacts of confirmed cases. So when you have a case that is infected, that individual who's infected with the SARS-CoV-2 virus needs to be provided with good clinical care, and they need to be isolated from others so that they don't have the opportunity to pass it to someone else. But before they go into isolation, they may have many contacts. And those contacts of individuals of cases need to be provided supported quarantine, which means they're separated from others and provided food and care and safety and security for 14 days while they wait and make sure that they're not infected themselves. They get a test themselves, but they don't have the opportunity to pass to others. South Africa is a good example where they got through their first peak. Countries across Asia and Pacific, including Australia and New Zealand. But in fact, we've actually seen really strong responses across Europe during their first peak, where over the summer months in Europe, cases were down to single digits. And they showed us, and many countries across Africa, across Europe, across the Americas, have shown that they can drive transmission down. And this is really, really critical now that we have these virus variants being detected, because the more opportunities this virus has to spread, the more opportunities it has to change. So we need to make sure we prevent as many infections as we can.
Which part of the world is going to be most complicated to vaccinate?
Ooh, that's a great question. We need to vaccinate people at risk all over the world. So I think there are different complicating factors in different parts of the world for different reasons. But what we want to make sure that we do is, number one, that we have multiple safe and effective vaccines that are in production, that continue to be tested, continue to be studied, to continue to come online.
Are you
that
concerned
we have
by
good
this
production capacities
AstraZeneca
all
report?
over the world? Say that again?
Are you concerned by this reporting that AstraZeneca's vaccine may not be effective against the South African variant B1351?
Yes, so the B1351 variant first identified in South Africa, there's a number of studies that are underway to look at the response of the body, the immune response of the body, but also the impact of vaccination. There are some preliminary studies suggesting reduced efficacy, but again, those studies aren't fully published yet, and our group, our independent panel group on vaccinations is meeting tomorrow to specifically discuss the AstraZeneca vaccine as well as the results coming out of South Africa to determine what does this mean in terms of the vaccines going forward. But this is why it's really, really critical that we have more than one safe and effective vaccine. We cannot rely on only one product, and that is not the goal of anyone around the world. So that is definitely something we need to continue to push forward. But again, vaccines are not just enough. It's vaccination that's really critical. We need to make sure everyone who is at risk, the elderly, people who are most at risk for severe disease, receive the vaccine in all countries around the world, as well as health workers all around the world, as opposed to everybody in just a handful of countries.
World Health Organization investigators, a year after the outbreak began in China, have now been allowed in to look at what happened on the ground. Is this just a show by the Chinese government?
No, it's not. In fact, we have a team of 10 international scientists. You call them investigators, but indeed they're scientists from a number of different technical fields, as well as people from WHO, my colleagues, and we have colleagues from FAO and OIE who are supporting the mission as well. And these are studies that are ongoing to find the virus origins and understand the intermediate hosts. What were the zoonotic origins of this pandemic? And this is really, really critical from a public health perspective so that we know and we can take steps further to prevent this from happening again. There are very good discussions that are having on the ground. There are constructive exchanges between this international team from 10 different countries, as well as the Chinese counterparts, looking at the earliest cases, looking at studies from the markets. They've had visits to hospitals. They've had visits to laboratories, including the Wuhan Institute of Virology, as well as visiting different levels of the Chinese Centers for Disease Control. So we're hoping for the report as soon as possible, and that will be made available as soon as it can be.
All right, Doctor, thank you for your time this morning. Good luck to you. We'll be right back with Dr. Scott Gottlieb. We want to go now to former FDA Commissioner Dr. Scott Gottlieb. He sits on the board of Pfizer as well as Illumina, and he joins us this morning from Westport, Connecticut. Good morning.
Good morning.
You just heard from Dr. Van Kerkhove, and she outlined all the mutations here. What is the bottom line from what she was laying out? I mean, she did seem to indicate there are concerns about this AstraZeneca vaccine and its efficacy against B1351 out of South Africa.
Well, I think as a rule of thumb, we can assume that the vaccines are probably going to be about 20% less effective against these new variants from Brazil and South Africa, which has mutated some key regions of the protein that we target with our vaccines. We've seen that now in a Novavax trial and the J&J trial, as well as with the AstraZeneca vaccine. The mRNA vaccines, and I'm on the board of Pfizer, which developed one of those, are very efficacious. And so even if we see a reduction in the efficacy of those vaccines, and it may not be as profound with those vaccines, you're still getting very good protection with those vaccines. And frankly, you're getting very good protection with the J&J vaccine as well. So I do think that the existing vaccines are going to offer reasonable protection against these new variants. And we also may be able to develop in a timely fashion, maybe in 4 or 6 months, a consensus strain that bakes in a lot of the different variation that we're seeing, to have boosters available for the fall. So I think that there is a reasonable chance that we're going to be able to stay ahead of this virus as it mutates. Trevor Bedford at the Hutch has done some good work on this, and some people are speculating right now that this virus may have undergone a really significant evolutionary leap, if you will. It's mutated a lot all at once in different parts of the world, but it's not going to continue to mutate at the same rate. It may have reached a new fitness level, but it's going to slow down. It's not going to continue to change as much, so we're going to be able to keep up with it.
I asked the doctor about the probe underway in China. From your view, how important is it to know the origins of the first strain that we learned of with COVID-19 in China?
Well, look, I think it's important from a political standpoint, and I think it's important from a public health standpoint, so we know what the risk is for future transmission, for future jumps from zoonotic sources into the human population, and we kind of better understand the risk from coronaviruses more generally. I don't think we're going to find out, and we're certainly not going to be able to find out with any level of certainty that's going to put to rest some of the speculation that this could have been a lab source. Now, most people believe that this was a zoonotic source. You know as well as I do, there's still speculation, even in the government, that it could have been from an accident in the laboratory. We know that Wuhan laboratory was doing a lot of experimentation, had a big repository of coronaviruses. I don't expect that the WHO mission is going to firmly put that to rest. We would need access to the source strains. I suspect they're not going to get that. That information, if it's available, the Chinese government would have that, and so far they have not made that available.
You told us on this program last Sunday that it was Miami and Southern California that you were most concerned about as hotspots for this B117 strain detected in the UK. Are those still the areas of greatest concern for you?
Yeah, and Florida is growing pretty significantly. Right now, between 5 and 10% of the infections in Florida are B117, that UK variant, the more contagious variant, and that's centered in southern Florida. I think that what's going to happen in Florida right now, they're continuing to show declines in new infections like the rest of the country. I think as the rest of the country continues to come down that curve, you're going to see a leveling off in Florida. And while I don't think that they're going to have another surge of infection, they could have persistent high infection because B117 is gaining a better foothold in that part of the country. Southern California is probably right now about 5% of infections are B117, so they're a little further behind Florida. For the rest of the country, it's probably less than 1% all around the country. Now, there could be localized hotspots, particular counties where you have an outbreak of B117, but I think for the most part around the country, it's probably too little too late. We'll probably be able to get ahead of it with our vaccines and the seasonal effect from the warming weather.
Getting ahead of it's a good thing. The CDC is expected to release guidelines this week on how to safely reopen schools. The CDC director said vaccination of teachers is not a prerequisite. What should be a prerequisite?
Well, I think the prerequisite is putting in place mitigation steps in the schools. The school districts that have reopened successfully, and there was good data out of North Carolina where they did some systematic research looking at the experience in those schools which were open, showed that when they wear masks, when they distance, when they try to take precautions in the classroom, there's very little transmission within the classroom. The schools are not a vector of transmission, and especially children under the age of 14 are less likely to both get infected and transmit the infection. I think it certainly would be good to be able to prioritize teachers to get them vaccinated so they're not at risk from contracting the infection and spreading the infection. But I don't think it's necessarily a prerequisite. I think schools have demonstrated that they can open safely if they take precautions in the classroom.
When it comes to getting vaccines out there, we know retail pharmacies will begin receiving shipments this week. The Biden administration sticking with that Trump plan of giving doses based on population. Is this the best way to get doses into the arms of the public?
I think for now, they've made a lot of progress. We've hit some days where there's 2 million vaccines that have been delivered. I think we're going to see that more consistently. That's going to be the run rate. As we get into March, by the end of March, we'll have delivered 250 million vaccines onto the market if the J&J vaccine gets authorized. And in April, we'll probably deliver another 100 million vaccines onto the market. If you assume a 60-40 split between first doses and second doses, you assume about 60% of the supply that's coming onto the market is going to first doses. By the end of March, we'll have delivered 150 million vaccines, and in April, another 60 million. We're going to run out of demand. I mean, I think we need to start thinking about the demand side of this equation soon.
Okay. Dr. Gottlieb, good to talk to you as always. And we'll be back with a preview of Super Bowl 55. Stay with us.
Hello and welcome to the Super Bowl. 4 hours of television for 11 minutes of action. I am James, no, not that one, Brown. As everyone at home knows, this year has been anything but normal. The pandemic, racial and political divisions, Army Hammer. But today we come together in a spirit of unity to watch football and murder billions of chickens for their delicious wings.
That, of course, was not CBS, but last night's Saturday Night Live. And we want to go now to the real James Brown. JB is CBS News special correspondent and host of the NFL Today. But really, JB, you don't need any introduction here. How are you doing?
Margaret, I didn't see the beginning of SNL. My text messages started blowing up as I'm trying to go to bed last night, but that's an appropriate opening to say the least, so I'm looking forward to it, and thank you for giving me a little bit of levity to start.
Well, congratulations. This is your 10th Super Bowl, I understand, but I mean, I have no doubt, have never seen anything quite like pulling this off in the midst of a pandemic. What is going to be different this year?
Well, the fact that we won't have a packed house, that adds immeasurably to any big event, the pomp and circumstance of it and the excitement of the fans. We won't have that, but the players will be thrilled to have at least the 22 to 25,000 who will be there. That really does influence them significantly. Obviously, a lot of the pomp and circumstance surrounding the Super Bowl, the parties, the celebrations, and all of those things have been non-existent. So it's a little different that way, but we're glad to get to this point. Heavens, who would have thunk it that we would have gone through 17 weeks of the regular season, getting 256 games in, and now we're at the Super Bowl. But that's a real tribute to the players, the teams, and the coaches who have adhered to the COVID protocols by and large throughout the season, Margaret.
Well, it's significant that there even is a Super Bowl. But I'm wondering, JB, what are you hearing about what comes next for the league? Are we going to see athletes get vaccinated or be part of sort of a public relations push to encourage Americans to go get that shot in the arm?
Excellent question. A number of players are doing that at present, and I'm certain, given that you're involved in news full time, you know that there's been a bit of a challenge in communities of color to embrace the vaccination. So you see a number of the athletes, especially those of color, who are doing PSAs to encourage people. You know, personally, I say it's a personal decision. Do your homework and examine it to see what makes sense for you. But there is a push. I would think we'll see a lot more of that. However, the other elephant in the room is I've been told by league officials that they will not advocate for having a priority position in terms of being vaccinated, because as you well know, with the sobering news surrounding this, there are far more people who are in need of that as opposed to athletes trying to move to the front of the line.
Mm-hmm. We spoke to the head of the Players Association about that question the other day, DeMaurice Smith, and he shared with us something else that I want to get your reaction to. And that is frustration, frankly, among many players with the lack of diversity among coaching staff in particular. And he said, unfortunately, we've had some former coaches of color who I think have given excuses or cover for the league in this. Those are some sharp words. What do you make of that assessment?
Well, you know, today on our pregame show, I'm going to address that very issue with a commentary of my own coming off of an excellent but sobering piece that's entitled Before Jackie, meaning before Jackie Robinson. And that will be in the 4 o'clock hour of our pregame show. And it addresses, sadly, part of the history was there were a number of owners back in 1933 who collaborated and consciously, deliberately made a decision to eliminate black players from the league. And it was 13 years later before, when the team moved to California, Los Angeles specifically, playing in a stadium that was in a minority community, meaning they paid taxpayer dollars, and they said they weren't going to allow it. And that's when Kenny Washington broke the color barrier. So the fact is, sadly, there is a history that I know definitively that Roger Goodell, the commissioner, Troy Vincent, the highest ranking African-American, have done everything possible to create an environment and a culture to that. And the bottom line is equality of opportunity is all that is sought. Male and female, there's no division. I'm so happy to see full-time female assistants on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers that you'll get a chance to see. And bottom line, there's a McKinsey report that came out in May 2020 that said diversity wins, inclusion matters. We have a wonderful mosaic here in America of people of all hues and stripes, and excellence comes in all hues and stripes. So why not take advantage of that to improve the bottom line and the culture and winning with that attitude?
You know, football and activism really became a hot topic in the past few years. Where does that conversation go next? Is it coaches, or is it in another direction?
Coaches, quite frankly, are low-hanging fruit. Look, when the league was open up to diversity, it's not surprising that half the number of players who are in the Hall of Fame are players of color. Black players specifically. The same thing, I'm going to be talking with Amy Trask, who has been and still is, sadly, the only female CEO of a team. It's going to continue to move forward because I think people see that and embrace it, and it only makes sense.
JB, it's always good to get your reflections. Good luck to you today. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, by the way, Margaret, Keenan on SNL, he had a better hairline than me, and his mini afro looked a lot better than my micro afro. But thank you for having me on anyway.
I like the real JB. We'll be right back. And there's more from the head of the NFL Players Union, DeMaurice Smith, on our latest podcast. We hope you'll listen and enjoy today's game safely. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.